We dropped, I think it was $500,000 in Bitcoin. All of that, I think, is still unfolding. Went down the rabbit hole. I was extremely naive in thinking that this could happen really quickly, taking a lot of risk, right? We still have to realize so much of its potential.
This episode is brought to you by Moonbeam. Moonbeam is an L1. It's part of the Polkadot ecosystem, and it's EVM compatible. You might remember it from a few years back, and that's actually because they're doing an ongoing relaunch. And as part of that relaunch, they're doing the Moonbeam Moonrise Points campaign. So what does that mean? You can go out to Oku Trade, which is powered by Uniswap v3, or StellaSwap, or BeamSwap, and provide liquidity, swap tokens from X to Y, Z to Z. To get on over to Moonbeam, you can make sure that you use either the Parachain Bridge, the Wormhole Bridge, or the Axelar Bridge, or potentially even all three. Moonbeam is now also integrated on Rarible, and they're working with creators to drop collections on Moonbeam. And right now, participants can collect points by buying off the secondary market, and in upcoming weeks, participants will be able to have even more opportunities in future drops and open mints. Now, this quest page that tells you, like, oh, I'm going to get XYZ points, that can be found at quests.moonbeam.network. That's quests.moonbeam.network. So if you're the type that likes to play around in this type of environment, because you're a DeFi nut, you're an NFT extraordinaire, then head on over to quest.moonbeam.network, get yourself started, and check it out. They're a nice team.
Welcome. This is Overexposed. I'm your host, Eddie, aka Dancing Eddie, and this is
Kristin Catalini.
What's up, man? How we doing?
Good, how are you?
Nice to meet you.
Great to be here.
So, all right. When I host these shows, what I like to tell a lot of guests is, honestly, I do a base level research to find out, who you are, what your interests are, etc. But I don't do crazy research because I want to find out who you actually are. I know you're a researcher, but tell me about that. Like, what are your interests? What brought you to researching, etc., etc.?
Yeah, so I started my journey into crypto back in 2013 when we did the Bitcoin experiment at MIT. I was always drawn to kind of technologies that can really expand access to payments, financial services across the globe. My entry into the space was actually through crowdfunding.
Really?
Back in 2007, there was a platform that many don't remember out of the Netherlands called Salaband.
Okay.
That was the very first platform allowing artists to really earn money directly from their audience, fund their projects, and then kind of share the returns of those with everyone else. So that was my entry into it, and then got into Bitcoin. And I've been in the space ever since.
So from crowdfunding to Bitcoin, was that just like you stumbled upon a white paper at some point and you're like, that's pretty sweet? Or did someone lead you in?
I kind of started reading about it, I think it was early 2010, 2011, when there was some buzzing in some of the forums and other things. And I still remember actually going to my advisor at the time when I was doing my PhD and saying, this looks super interesting. Someone should research it. And I think he thought I was a bit of a lunatic back in the day. It's like, okay, let's focus on getting you out of the program and getting you a real job. But that's what I did. When I got my first job, I went back to crypto and started researching it even more. Fell in love with it. Went down the rabbit hole, and yeah, to me, it's still kind of surprising that so many years into the Bitcoin experiment, right, we still have to realize so much of its potential.
So then what motivates you in that sense? Like what exactly, you said you fell in love with it, what exactly about crypto as a payment rail solution or whatever it may be, what motivates you about it?
I think it's really powerful when you look at networks that are open, the internet kind of being the largest example of it, how much of society and the economy they can really reshape over time, really enabling people that previously didn't have access to it to enjoy, the benefits of financial services or banking or payments. All of that, I think, is still unfolding, and it's super early days. It's kind of impressive that, again, we're 10 years or more into the Bitcoin experiment, but still, many people around the globe don't have access to really basic financial services and the experiences that we give for granted here in the United States. And so that's really motivating, right? Trying to see this technology come to its full potential, it's really exciting.
So, and you mentioned that you started back in 2011 with Bitcoin, correct? And now, obviously, it's now 13 years later, 13, 14. My question is, what did you if you started researching back then, and now, here we are all these years later, what have you learned, or at least what have you seen from your initial reviews and initial research that has played out, that hasn't played out differently than you've expected in that time?
I would say the biggest difference is really speed. When you approach this as an academic, like I did back in the day, you look at kind of the technology from an economic lens, and you can kind of charge a path, right? You can see where it's going. What you don't know, and I was very naive about it, is how quickly you can get there, right? So if you look at it from a purely economics perspective, it's very clear that Bitcoin and crypto in general has so many benefits, right, to bring. But then, to change society, to change the system and upgrade it, takes a very long time. So I would say when we did the Bitcoin experiment, back in the day, we dropped, I think it was $500,000 in Bitcoin to all the MIT undergrads. I was probably convinced that within 2 years, this would really change the tone and the usage and the engagement. Here we are. Bitcoin is still predominantly kind of an investment vehicle, whether some people think of it as digital gold or not. We have yet to really, I think, release the potential of Bitcoin as a network, as a new type of infrastructure. And looking back, I was extremely naive in thinking that this could happen really quickly. I think the reality is that, Bitcoin and crypto is a general purpose technology. Think of it like, the steam engine, electricity, all of these things, including AI. And the progress on those technologies is measured in decades, is not measured in years. Right. Because you almost have to rewire the entire system for the technology to be really useful. There's some interesting example historically, like when electricity came about, right? Factories have to be reshaped and redesigned
literally
to switch from steam to electricity. And so for many years, people were saying, well, this electricity thing is kind of cute, but somewhat useful in some situations, but not always. Of course, nobody would question that today. And I think crypto is the same, right? So when I started, at least, talking to academic colleagues about crypto, they're like, this looks like a Ponzi. Why would you print money through, this proof of work mechanism? And I think many years later, there's still a lot of people that look at the technology and are very skeptical. And I think it's on all of us to really deliver, both progress in the real world in terms of applications, but also the kind of research that can inspire policymakers, regulators, that there's a lot here. There's a lot of potential.
It's an insane increase in inertia and momentum that's been wild to watch with Bitcoin specifically. Especially, I was talking with someone the other day, and it's just to think in 2022 we were just reeling off of the back of things like SBF, and 2 years later it's now a political platform, which is wild. But you mentioned specifically MIT. What brought you there? What's the whole story there? Because that is a serious institution we're talking about.
I was always passionate about innovation and entrepreneurship. And so when I finished my PhD, typically you go on the academic job market, so you do a bunch of flyouts to different institutions. And I was lucky, to get an offer from MIT. That was kind of my top choice, mostly because it's an institution that's known for taking a lot of risk. I was a newly minted assistant professor when I essentially went through the process for the Bitcoin experiment. Now imagine you have someone that you just hired that comes and says, we're going to do a research study. We're going to drop Bitcoin to everyone. And those were the days where people were thinking.
You said $500,000.
It was $500,000. Alumni had pooled together resources. Actually, our students. This was a project initiated by students. Jeremy Rubin and Dan Elitzer back in the day. They sent a few emails. They raised the money. And then as the Bitcoin Club, they were told by the administration, you can't distribute it. It's too risky. Those were the days where people had Silk Road in mind and all sort of like.
And this is what year exactly?
2013.
2013.
And so I was engaged with them already, and I'm like, look, if we design it as a research study, we go through the proper IRB process, we can actually learn something from it. It's not just about distributing Bitcoin. I was a lot more interested in when you expose young minds that are creative and curious to this new technology, what will they do with it, right? Will they start building things? Will they start, saving it? Turns out, one of the key results of the experiment, and then we looked also at privacy choices and other dimensions, was that most MIT students just kept their Bitcoin. And it sounds obvious in retrospect. Those $100 are probably worth more than $30K today. But back in the day, we were puzzled. It's like, why aren't they transacting? Why aren't they trying new things? Turns out they were smarter than all of us, right? They figured that this was an asset worth investing in and waiting.
Interesting. So what did you find through there, though? Like, when you asked them, why aren't you guys spending? Was it a lack of interest in spending? Was it a level of anticipation that it actually would play out and increase in price? Or what did you actually find in the research?
I think so. As part of the, turning it into a proper research study, we delivered a lot of educational content. So it wasn't just, here's your, $100 in Bitcoin, which at the day was like a third of a Bitcoin.
Right.
It was like, this is what the technology is about. These are the choices you have to make in terms of wallet. Do you want to be custodial or non-custodial? All of this. And I would say that most students that held their Bitcoin, they just understood there's a limited supply. This is a technology with a lot of potential. Bitcoin, the network, one day might be the piping for all of the financial system. And so they wanted a piece of it. And we gifted it to them, and they wanted to hold on to it. In fact, in the first 2 weeks, the people that were not interested cashed out right away.
Really?
Or some people, there was one location in Cambridge that accepted actually Bitcoin. It was a sushi restaurant.
No.
I mean, that was probably for some people the most expensive sushi restaurant, of their life. Yeah, by far.
That's amazing. So some people just went out and got sashimi instead.
Yeah, that was one of the things you could do with Bitcoin on campus. I had emails over the years of students that told me, look, I paid my tuition with it. So
Really?
that was really important for my student debt. Others like, hey, this was great. I'm now, in a Bitcoin company or like in crypto in general. That to me was always the most meaningful part of this, which is you take some young minds, you kind of teach them about the technology, you expose them to it, you gift them a small piece of the Bitcoin puzzle, and then, they get curious and they try things. So I don't know anybody has done a proper job of tracing them all, but I would imagine a good share of them are building companies in this space.
So did you see at the time, let's say 6 months of initial distribution, did you notice a lot of students go out and acquire more Bitcoin or begin mining or doing any other activities to that end? Or did most of the individuals that you distributed to either hold or immediately cash out?
This is where, doing a research study had limitations in terms of what we could track. So we did decide to track what they did with the initial amount, but nothing else. And in fact, after about 300 days, we kind of cut off and all the data,
And just a bunch of other stuff comes in anecdotally later on through
Correct.
emails.
You get an email from a student saying, hey, yeah, I remember. In fact, someone that works at the company that I co-founded, Lightspark, was part of the experiment and is one of our great designers on the team, yeah.
That's wild. That is a wild story. Now, with stuff like that and other research that you've done, what questions do you have that you either wanted to find out an answer to and were unable to and are just otherwise unanswered, or things that have come up on your mind that, at this point, I haven't had time to do a concerted study on it, but this is a question that I really want to find the answer to?
I think there's a number of really important questions in this space that are fully unanswered, and that's what makes the space exciting. For the longest time, I think there was a bit of a stigma around crypto, so it was difficult even for young PhD students or junior faculty to jump onto the topic. Not unlike some of the challenges that we face with regulators and policymakers. I think that has changed. And so you're seeing a lot more work at the intersection of computer science and economics in crypto. I think to me, there's still some really interesting open questions around market design. Proof of work is probably the most established way that we have to bootstrap these systems, and Bitcoin is, of course, the leading example of that. We have new experiments in proof of stake. I think that area is still a lot more
underdeveloped. Do you have an opinion on that, on proof of stake specifically?
Look, to me, proof of work, it's a bit like the Churchill quote. It's like, if you think about all the different forms of governance, proof of work is really it's the one that unfortunately has limitations, but it's the most effective and the most battle tested. That's why when I think about, the networks in this space, Bitcoin, is in a very particular position in terms of both its history, legitimacy, but also security and governance. The track record is really unique. What Ethereum did, I think, in transitioning to proof of stake is super important because now we're seeing a different type of experiment, but I think it's super, super early days, right? So staking, restaking, all of these are topics that I think haven't been battle tested yet. And so we'll see at scale how they perform. I wouldn't be surprised if researchers will be able to improve those protocols. Then you have a long tail of other things that have been tried in crypto, including around algorithmic stablecoins that are a lot less solid. But it's exciting to see researchers really use economics and market design and incentives to build new types of platforms. To me, that was always the promise of this space, which is we have concentration in big tech and in kind of many of the systems that we use every day. I think we've seen it with CrowdStrike, the recent outage. Single points of failures can be pretty damaging when they fail. And crypto is the technology to solve for that. That said, I think we're probably still a decade out before we see the fruits of that.
Interesting. Although, would you be surprised if it was way sooner than a decade? Considering the rate of speed you were mentioning earlier.
I would say so, and probably, I'm going to be wrong. Economists are terrible at predictions, but things tend to happen slowly and then suddenly, right? So if you think about the internet and something like Amazon, right? So for the longest time, people looked at Amazon and felt, okay, this is an online bookstore. And then suddenly it was an everything store. So there was a discontinuous jump in how people perceived and were able to use that. I think the same is going to be true for Bitcoin and payments. I think of crypto as layers, right? So we first have to crack payments and make it the backbone for global money movement and all of that. Then on top of that, we'll start building some of the pieces of the financial infrastructure again. And then maybe we'll be able to build new platforms, whether it's social media or, creator economy or whatnot. So it's going to be in sequence. Maybe we'll jump around, but I think you're probably right. To get to the end of that, it's going to take another 10 years.
And you mentioned stablecoins, and you mentioned payments. How do you think about I wouldn't call it a dilemma, but the difference between making payments available in stablecoins versus making payments available in Bitcoin, especially with things like Lightning and all the efforts that were surrounded that, but also increasingly Bitcoin layer 2s as of late and other things that are coming around. So how do you compare and contrast payments with Bitcoin versus stablecoins?
Look, stablecoins are an interesting shortcut, and they have a number of trade-offs. As you may know, I was part of the Libra project, was one of kind of the people that worked on the early design of it. Stablecoins can deliver massive value in payments globally at scale if they're properly designed. But as we've seen also in the past, and even in recent events with the depegging and Silicon Valley Bank, proper stablecoin design is very hard. And so when you zoom out, in many, many years of crypto, what have we built and what have we done? Often, regulators and others look at it and say, nothing has happened, right? Where's the killer app? Bitcoin is the killer app, right? So we have this global asset that's available 24/7 that people can use for moving value anywhere on the globe. There's no central party involved, which is way better than a stablecoin. And there's a lot of liquidity. So if I'm trying to move value between, London on a Friday afternoon when the banks are closed to New York or anywhere else on the globe, it turns out that we do have a digital asset that's already established and ready, and that is Bitcoin. So stablecoins will play a role. I think you'll see actually a flurry of deposit tokens come about. Those are less crypto and they're more like banking, and the banks will want to play a role in that, maybe even the credit card companies and others. But at the end, we do have one network that we can all access, that we can all use, and that is Bitcoin. So again, a lot of exciting things for stablecoins maybe a few years from now. But if you were trying to build a payments experience today, actually, Bitcoin is already
is the best
ready.
railroad now.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. And specifically with the stablecoins, right? Obviously, there's not just one. It's stable coins for many different types of your currencies, but also the way that they stay pegged to a dollar is first off, not always necessarily consistent.
Correct.
And there's many differences between them. I'm curious, at a high level, what are your opinion on stable coins, the differences between them, et cetera?
So we wrote a paper with Alonso de Gortari back before the Terra Luna meltdown, where we actually divided stablecoins in two big categories and then subcategories and groups.
Sure.
The first big one is fiat-backed, right? So think about the ones that we all know, like USDT, USDC, the Paxos coins, and all of those, right? In those, the exercise is actually very narrow and it's very well understood. You need highly liquid assets that you can redeem at any point in time, so that if someone wants their money back, you can always give them a full dollar. In Libra, we probably proposed the best design for a reserve. And so I think that is kind of the gold standard. And any issuer that uses that model is going to deliver a very safe form of a dollar in tokenized form.
And how exactly would you say that plays out? Like, in shorthand, explain to me the Libra model.
Yeah, so the idea was to hold very short-term treasuries. Think of it as 3 months or less, and then a de minimis component of cash. What happened with Silicon Valley Bank, when Silicon Valley Bank ran into trouble, the issue was that some stablecoin issuers were holding very large amounts of cash at the bank. If you hold an amount of cash that's substantial, it's uninsured. And so there was a risk that if they weren't able to wire that money out, or if the FDIC and everybody else hadn't stepped in, the stablecoin would have lost whatever amount
substantial
of
reserves.
And I think it was about $3 billion. So that would have been a pretty significant loss. Now that's the challenge with a model where you're holding cash. People think of cash at a bank as the safest, but it's only safe up to your FDIC coverage. And of course, if you're running a stablecoin, that doesn't really translate because we don't have the proper regulation for it. Again, if you design a stablecoin that can always redeem and holds very safe assets like short-term US Treasuries, you're going to be fine. Most stablecoins are not designed that way, even today, even the ones that scale. But then there's another category, and this is probably the more dangerous one, as we've seen with Terra Luna, which is algorithmic stablecoins. We thought a lot, from a research perspective about, can you actually design a safe algorithmic stablecoin? And the short answer is no. It's almost like in economics, you can defeat certain basic laws. And so every algorithmic stablecoin, no matter how complex, how fancy, how sophisticated the economics or the computer science are, tries to solve an impossible problem. It's trying to link something that's only present on-chain, a digital asset, to something that exists in the real world. And that bridge, that last mile, is where the fractures happen. So it's very simple to keep that bridge stable. If you have a regulated entity, you hold assets that, again, really track the dollars, like treasuries. But once you're trying to do it all within a blockchain, it's almost an impossible job. There's always going to be a risk, as we've seen, that if expectations change, if people start running on the stablecoin, if weird behaviors like even, think about the Soros attack on the Bank of England emerge because market makers or others are trying to take advantage of it, the system will collapse. So unfortunately, there's no good solution from an economics perspective for an algorithmic stablecoin.
Hopefully you guys are enjoying that conversation. We're going to take a quick pause to be like, hey, wait a minute. Did you check out Moonbeam? I told you about them earlier. Mind you, you don't need to do anything different. Like, if you already have a MetaMask, if you're already integrated on EVM, you are good to go. And you can find that at things like moonbeam.network/news, and you can find out all the things that they've been up to. But I'm not going to bore you with that right now. Just go check it out. Its interoperability is enhanced by supporting various protocols like Axelar, Wormhole, Layer 0, XCM, and Glacis, making Moonbeam a central hub for secure and seamless communication across multiple blockchain networks.
Have you seen any examples of, this actually might have a chance of working, or at least working for an extended period of time as an algorithmic stablecoin? Like, are there any instances in which you could see an algorithmic stablecoin being an optimal route? Or would you say generally it is, either dangerous or at worst destined to fail?
2 points on that. So the first one is that as we get more RWAs on chain, you'll be able to do it, right? So imagine you have tokenized real estate or tokenized treasuries or all of these eventually on chain, properly represented, then you could imagine something repackaging those and issuing an algorithmic stablecoin properly. So that's kind of cheating, right? It's like saying, okay, if I have a good representation of other assets, I can build a stablecoin on top of it. But there are interesting designs where we kind of understand what the constraints are. So you think about something like Maker, right? It's expensive. It's over-collateralized. You will understand where it breaks. You know when kind of, at some point, redemptions may not happen. But I think if people are aware of the constraints and even don't think of them as stablecoins, I somewhat think that stablecoin is a misnomer, right? It's like we could have different assets that have different properties. And as long as the holder understands that, look, most of the time I'm going to get $1 out, but maybe sometimes I could get a 20%, 30% ERCAT. But I do really value the decentralization or some of the additional features that I get by being able to use it in DeFi or whatnot, then I think that's completely fair. Probably we shouldn't just call them stablecoins and bundle them all together.
And it's funny because every time we've mentioned stablecoins, we've said the word dollar, although it's not.
Correct.
It's not necessarily like there's no law that it must be $1. In fact, there's even questions as to what governments might like, how they might approach stablecoins generally. So, at a high level, what do you expect, or at least how do you think about how governments, particularly the U.S., but otherwise, generally, might approach stablecoins going forward?
We've seen a lot of that through the Libra journey, and the bar for that project was always very high, right? Because people imagine 3 billion users essentially on the network. And the answer is actually pretty simple. Often in crypto, we tend to ignore it, but regulators expect proper compliance, right? So if you're moving value, they want to make sure that you're not a bad actor, you're not violating sanctions and all of that. They also want to ensure that your reserve design is solid, right? So they want to make sure that, head of a stablecoin company cannot take those funds and appropriate them and then, run away with funds or do anything else that would be risky. Imagine, you're limited to investing in non-risky assets. You suddenly want to make a bet on Bitcoin. And if it goes well, of course, you take the profit. If it doesn't go well, too bad for the holders of the
Right.
stablecoin. So reserve design and consumer protection around that are really important. Compliance is another big bucket. And then in general, like we do need new legislation. So in the United States, we don't have a framework for stablecoins. And in fact, most stablecoins operate with state licenses, state by state. And as you can imagine, states are probably not the best equipped for something that could be global in scale. Right. So it's kind of a new space.
Now, specifically, one of the things that's interesting is when you talk about things like compliance, specifically for coins like USDC, and you consider it in the realm of, comparing that to what most crypto users want, there are concerns with things like, I believe USDC has a freezing feature where the issuer can freeze assets. And I'm curious what you think about, let's say, an asset, like specifically a stablecoin's ability to do things that conflict with the ethos that most crypto users prefer. Like, for example, Bitcoin, many people would call it censorship resistant, right? Whereas a lot of stablecoins, a lot of people would say are kind of in many ways the exact opposite, or at least the antithesis. How do you think that either crypto users generally, or like how do you think that dichotomy meshes with the world of crypto?
I think people have to realize that these are different assets with different properties, and they will solve different problems. So if you really care about censorship resistance, then Bitcoin is really the way to go. If you're trying to move dollars and you're not worried about sanctions or anything else, then stablecoin is completely fine. It's just a different set of trade-offs. You always have a central actor in a stablecoin, right? And so the central actor will have to follow the rules of the region that he operates in.
And do you think that other stablecoins that aren't based off the dollar, whether it's, say, something like a Swiss franc or any other currency, might pick up usability? Or do you think, at least for, let's say the next few years, it's angling towards dollars being the primary stablecoin?
I think there's a big role for the dollars to play, like it plays in the current economy. But look, 5-10 years from now, people won't even think of these as stablecoins. They'll be using payments. They will see their own currency, euros, nairas, Mexican pesos, dollars, and they'll just transact. The same way you don't think of your dollars at Bank of America any different than your dollars at Citi or Chase, right? We need to get to that level of simplicity and abstraction. And so, yeah, maybe there's a stablecoin involved behind the scenes. Maybe there's Bitcoin. Maybe there's something else. But it doesn't really matter. Consumers will not want to hold USD A, B, C, D.
Right. Imagine it's like, I want to pay, but I can't take USDT.
Right.
It has to be USDC. It's frustrating, right? And it's also interesting because you compare the two, right? USDT, USDC, and other stablecoins. I'm curious how you think about the markets that are established between them. Let's say, you have plenty of market makers that like to arbitrage the difference in terms of, send $1 million or $10 million in for a 0.001% difference. But I'm just, I'm fascinated by the markets. I'm curious what your opinion is on the markets between them.
Look, stablecoins are going to be commodified, right? So they're not going to generate a lot of revenue. People will think of them as interchangeable. The spreads and margins will be extremely thin. Think about the FX market today, right? So currencies move between each other at tight spreads. That's where stablecoins are headed, even more so. So you have banks issue stablecoins, you have maybe tech companies issue stablecoins, you have all sort of players, retail companies maybe issue stablecoins the same way they do reward cards and loyalty cards today. Ironically, one of the largest stablecoin issuers is Starbucks, right? When you hold balance in the app, that's kind of a stablecoin.
Which is fascinating because people don't think about that. And Starbucks is, in a funny way, one of the largest holders of, we'll call it cash, or how exactly, talk to me about Starbucks for a moment. Because I once watched a video and it blew my mind that frankly, Starbucks as almost in a sense a bank because of not a bank, but just the amount of money that they have on hand from people that may never redeem their gift cards.
It's about $1 billion in balances. Yeah.
So how does that work? What's something interesting to be learned specifically from case studies like that, like the Starbucks world?
I think what's interesting is that, look, in crypto, we tend to focus a lot on the technology. Is it a stablecoin? Is it Bitcoin? Is it Ethereum? People care about getting a problem solved. And so why do you have a loyalty app on any brand that you care about? Is because you go there frequently, you want to spend quickly with low friction, and then you want rewards, right? And so that ecosystem, who cares that there's a stablecoin behind? It's a loyalty and reward ecosystem that builds that engagement with your audience. I think people have been doing the same in the NFT space, super early days, right? But if you think about a future where loyalty and engagement is rewarded and you hold the balance and maybe you get some perks for it, then again, the technology will fade into the background. Everybody will use their favorite stablecoin behind the scenes, very much like you have a branded credit card today.
And actually, specifically, one more on the Starbucks thing. $1 billion that theoretically may never be redeemed, right?
I mean, Starbucks is a public company, so
right.
Yeah.
But like, how do companies like that approach money that may, could be in their bank account today and then tomorrow might need to be used? Like, how do you, as a company, or how do you advise a company to deal with massive amounts of reserve capital in that sense?
Look, there's going to be infrastructure providers at scale that take that complexity off, and those are going to be regulated entities. Even today, some stablecoins are issued, they're branded by someone, but there's a regulated entity behind the scenes that does the management of the reserve and everything else. So the future we're going towards is one where the brands may attach their name to it, but then there's going to be very solid infrastructure behind the scenes for issuing, for minting, for everything else.
Fascinating. Now, taking a step back, we're talking about stablecoins, and you also mentioned stablecoins that can go tremendously wrong. I'm curious, from a high level, what happened with Terra Luna?
So the irony of it is we described it in a paper many, many months before it happened. And the reason why we wrote that paper was that we had thought through all the permutations of algorithmic stablecoins as part of the Libra journey, and we had concluded that, look, none of these designs is actually safe. And regulators, of course, were very focused on Libra for obvious reasons, but they weren't paying much attention to things like Terra Luna. And in the paper, we describe a very simple thing that happened eventually later, sadly, which is when you have two tokens, one which you can almost think of as equity in the ecosystem, right? So if the Terra Luna ecosystem goes up, that token is worth something. If it goes down, you bear some risk. And then they issue this stable asset on the other end. Those systems are really prone to what economists call debt spirals. And debt spirals are nothing new. So currency boards, think about, Argentina and other countries went through the same motions, break in the same exact way. When expectations change, when people start worrying about it, and it could be totally irrational. It could be somebody spreads a rumor online about, hey, I don't know if this system is going to work. The moment expectations change, everybody has an incentive to run on the reserve first, because of course, if you run early, you may get your money out. The later you run, the least you get out. All of those systems will eventually run into trouble. So it was really a ticking bomb, and it was kind of surprising that nobody in this space was paying attention to it. And this was everyone, right? From investors to ecosystem participants. I think the ecosystem was too good to be true, and as we've seen, it was indeed too good to be true.
So why do you think that? Like, why do you think that, whether it's crypto investors generally, or at least the people that were involved in Terra Luna, what do you think are the circumstances that lead to something like that building up as large as it is with such, at least like seemingly clear risks that are associated?
Look, I think what happens often in crypto, but also in other, financial markets, is that we claim the markets are rational, but people are highly irrational. So often, there's a lemmings effect. If everybody's piling on and it seems like, that's social proof, people would trust that social proof and say, well, it wouldn't be worth $15 billion if others, thought it was risky. The problem with social proof is that everybody's assuming somebody else did the work. And in the case of Terra Luna and other designs, there's also often complexity that's added. So you will see really clever market design and incentives and different levers. And it's like, if there's a run, this will happen. And this other, remedy is in place. Often those remedies are worse than the actual problem. And so no matter how complex you make the design, again, one big takeaway for anyone in crypto is like, if you're seeing something algorithmic, there's always going to be a degree of risk because you can't really bridge a digital asset to an offline one without some connection there.
Now I know that you're saying that there's effectively no way that it could have been, like there's no way that Terra Luna could have been saved. But I'm curious if you think that there's any way that Terra Luna could have been cushioned, or at least the demise slowed with the death spiral.
It's actually it's kind of the opposite. So once you trigger a death spiral, you're already past.
It's over.
Yes, it's over. And the problem again in that case, it was actually some concern, right, that started triggering the momentum, but it could be just a rumor. So somebody could spread a rumor, short it, and get the same result.
It's fascinating how unbelievably low it went. Like going from roughly $100 to like 0.001 plus in a matter of weeks is unbelievable. Have you ever seen anything like experience such a cataclysmic cataclysmic death spiral?
It happens, in equities too. Sometimes, there's concerns about a company. You suddenly discover that, the fundamentals weren't real, or there was fraud, or yeah. So it does happen in traditional markets too.
Now, speaking of traditional markets, the last question that I have that's got me also fairly interested, right, is especially right now, as I mentioned earlier, you go from 2022, where FTX happens, everyone's like, crypto's dead. Or at least everyone takes the opportunity to dunk on crypto. Now, 2 years later, it's actually a fairly large political platform, and in part because of the conversations that come out with regulators. And if you're looking at things like what happened with Terra Luna and the conversations that spark around it, obviously regulators are fairly interested. But you look at the U.S. landscape specifically, which does have a pretty large effect on the world, and what the U.S. says at least tends to influence other countries. And you look at the SEC, which has been at least one of the primary regulators, at least trying to tackle crypto, and also now a shift towards potentially the CFTC taking over many regulatory issues that surround crypto. I'm curious what your opinion is in terms of how you foresee regulators approaching crypto over the course of the next few months, years, et cetera, whether that's in the US or abroad.
I think it's going to be important to have a comprehensive framework, right? So one of the challenges of the job that was done currently by the SEC was regulation by enforcement. And when that happens, you're trying to fit kind of an old model on a new construct. Crypto is novel, right? So there's some new opportunities, but there's also some new challenges. And I think until we have proper framework for stablecoins, we have proper frameworks for financial market infrastructure and the players, I think it's going to be very difficult for the space to thrive in the United States. So hopefully, we'll see new rules being written. I think there's broad agreement by, leading players in this space. They want to be regulated. They want regulatory clarity. Other countries have done it, right? So if you look at Singapore with MAS, we were just talking this morning about Gibraltar. There's a number of regions, including the European Union, right, with MICA, that have really put forward what the future may look like. It's not always perfect. It will need iteration and evolution. We haven't seen that in the United States. So my hope is that eventually we will see proper rules and the good actors will be able to thrive. The problem being that if you look at FTX was able to do what it was doing because, sure, it had a US entity, but the problems were abroad. They were offshore. So the lack of clear regulation actually doesn't help the good actors, and it actually favors others that want to take advantage of it.
And is there anything else that you find interesting or you kind of want to get off your chest? Anything else on your mind?
I think we covered a lot. I really hope that, again, the space has been going through a very difficult set of ups and downs over the last decade or so. I do hope that things stabilize and people start really building things that touch people and businesses, and we start solving problems. So that's the part I'm most excited about.
Thank you, Kristin.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.